Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775. It begins in stillness, June 17th, 1775. Early morning fog clings low over the Charlestown Peninsula, just north of Boston. The air is heavy, not just with the promise of heat, but with the strange hush that settles before men kill one another. Dew glistens on the tall grass of Breed's Hill. Somewhere down the slope, a dog barks. A child cries out in Charlestown village, unaware perhaps that it may be the last sunrise her father ever sees. And from Boston, just across the narrow water of the Charles River, British soldiers are awakening. Polished buckles, scarlet coats, loaded muskets. Today there will be blood. It was not meant to come to this. When tensions first flared in Boston, the tea dumped in the harbour, the tax protests, the rattling cries of no taxation without representation, many still believed reconciliation was possible. Even after the first gunfire at Lexington and Concord, some in the Continental Congress held out hope for peace. But hope is brittle in the hands of kings. By June of 1775, Boston was a city under siege. British General Thomas Gage, still technically the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, commanded roughly 6,500 regular troops stationed in the city. The Patriots, New England militiamen and volunteers from the countryside, had surrounded the British on all sides, bottling them in by land. Roads were blocked, supplies were scarce, and the redcoats were growing restless. George Washington had not yet arrived to take formal command of the Continental Army. The siege was being led by men like Artemus Ward, Israel Putnam, William Prescott, names now fading in the shadow of history. But in that moment, they bore the weight of a revolution. The decision to fortify the heights overlooking Boston, and thus provoke a direct British response, was bold, risky, perhaps even reckless. But it was also necessary. On the night of June 16th, under the cover of darkness, roughly 1,000 colonial soldiers quietly moved onto the Charlestown Peninsula. Their orders were to fortify Bunker Hill, the higher of two hills dominating the landscape. But whether by confusion, miscommunication, or tactical instinct, they began digging instead on Breed's Hill, slightly lower but closer to Boston and far more threatening to British control of the harbour. Under Colonel William Prescott's command, these men, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, set to work with pickaxes and shovels. They dug feverishly, sweat and blisters forming in the warm summer night. Earth piled high into breastworks, timber logs, sod walls, cannon placements, makeshift redoubts formed by midnight moonlight. One of the sentries, a young man from Concord named Samuel Warner, later recalled, "We dug like damned souls that night, for we knew dawn would bring the devil." By sunrise, British officers peering across the river were stunned. Where there had been open grassland the evening before, there now stood a defiant line of entrenchments, raised within musket range of the Royal Navy anchorage, and directly threatening British positions. This was no longer politics, this was war. General Gage called an emergency war council. Present were Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, all names that would soon etch themselves into American memory. Burgoyne reportedly remarked, "The rebels have done more in one night than my whole army could have done in a month." But pride runs deep in red coats. General Howe, confident, polished, and arrogant, insisted the position could not be allowed to stand. The hill must be taken and the colonials routed to preserve British authority and reputation. It would be a direct assault, classic 18th century infantry warfare. form up, advance in lines, bayonets at the ready, no flanking manoeuvres, no siege, no negotiation. They would crush the rebellion by spectacle, and in doing so they would learn a bitter lesson in the cost of underestimation. The British spent the morning preparing. Longboats ferried troops across the Charles River to the foot of the peninsula. More than 2,200 soldiers in gleaming scarlet coats assembled, grenadiers, light infantry, line companies and artillery crews. Among them were battle-hardened veterans of the Empire, men who had fought in the 7 Years' War, who had held colonies in the West Indies and the Indian subcontinent. And yet here they stood, preparing to fight American farmers with stolen artillery and borrowed powder. On the other side of the hill, the rebels waited. Colonel Prescott walked the lines with his officers, inspecting the crude ramparts, giving orders to conserve ammunition. Most of the men carried smoothbore muskets, old flintlocks, often privately owned, with limited range and accuracy. Others held axes, hunting knives, or nothing more than pitchforks. Ammunition was dangerously low. Prescott is said to have uttered the legendary phrase, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." It wasn't just a tactic, it was a necessity. Every musket ball mattered. The first British assault came just after midday. The red lines advanced slowly, drums beating in unison, bayonets gleaming in the summer sun. Officers barked commands, colours fluttered in the sea breeze. From Boston, citizens watched the display from rooftops and steeples, some cheering, others silent with dread. The Americans held their fire. Closer, closer, still closer. And then a sudden crack. A single musket barked, then another and another. And within seconds the entire American line erupted in a crashing volley of lead. British soldiers fell by the dozens, torn apart by musket balls, blasted back by cannon fire from the colonial redoubt. Screams echoed across the hillside. Smoke rolled like a ghost across the slope. The redcoats faltered, wavered, and then broke. They fell back down the hill, carrying wounded men and shattered pride. General Howe was livid. He reformed his ranks and ordered a second assault. This time, the British moved more cautiously, but again they advanced in tight formation. Again the Americans waited. And again the volley. More dead, more wounded, more screaming. The hillside was now slick with blood, the tall grass trampled, British uniforms soaked in red and dust. Officers struggled to rally their men. Many lay dying in the sun, baking under the June heat with no hope of rescue. A corporal from the 52nd Regiment would later recall, "We marched up that hill as if to certain doom. The smoke was thick, like marching through hellfire. I saw my captain's head burst like a melon, and still we marched." But ammunition does not last forever. By late afternoon, the colonial defenders were down to their final rounds. Some muskets were now nothing more than clubs. A few desperate men hurled stones. Others drew knives or fixed rusty bayonets to their barrels. They knew what came next. The third assault, the final push. This time the British came with vengeance. Howe ordered a full-scale frontal charge. No restraint, no retreat. Artillery pounded the American lines. Flames began licking the edges of Charlestown village as British ships fired incendiary shells to clear the town. And still they came. Over the corpses of their comrades, up the bloodied slope, bayonets gleaming once more. The Americans fought savagely, hand to hand, point blank, a tangle of limbs and gunpowder and steel. Colonel Prescott reportedly led the defence with a sword in hand, shouting encouragement, rallying men who had never seen battle before. But it was no use. With powder gone and the lines thinning, the redoubt was overrun. The British swarmed over the defences, stabbing, shooting, clubbing as they advanced. The defenders broke. Many fled. Some stayed to die in place. Among the fallen was Dr. Joseph Warren, physician, statesman, and hero of the early revolution. He had refused to take command that day, insisting on fighting as a private soldier beside his countrymen. A musket ball ended his life. He was 34. By evening, the hill belonged to the British. But their victory was hollow. They had taken the ground, yes. But at what cost? Over 1,000 British casualties, nearly half the assaulting force. Officers, men, and morale shattered. One British officer described it grimly. A few more such victories would ruin us. The Americans, despite retreating, had proven something far more powerful than military might. They had shown resolve, grit, the willingness to bleed. They had stood toe-to-toe with the greatest army in the world, and had not broken. That night, the campfires of the Revolution still burned bright. And across the Atlantic, the Crown began to realise this would not be an easy war. The smoke hadn't even cleared when the scavengers came. British soldiers picked their way through the rubble of the redoubt, muskets still warm, boots slick with blood. Some were grim-faced, dragging away wounded comrades. Others ransacked the fallen, collecting powder horns, cartridges, and the occasional coin. One officer stooped beside the body of Dr. Joseph Warren and stared a moment too long, as if surprised to find the revolution had a face. The hill was theirs, but no one celebrated. Not really. Victory had come too dear. Charlestown smouldered in ruins below, its church steeples cracked and blackened, its homes gutted by naval bombardment. The hillside above was strewn with British dead, red coats torn, arms flung unnaturally, many killed without ever firing a shot. General Howe, who had led the assaults in person, remained silent in the aftermath. He had lost more men in a single afternoon than at any point in his military career. 10 officers in his own regiment alone. Friends, gentlemen, gone. He had taken the hill, and in doing so, may have doomed the British cause. Across the water, in Cambridge and Roxbury, the American camps buzzed with conflicting emotions. Yes, they had retreated. The hill was lost. But spirits were high. There was a fierce pride in what they had achieved. They had stood. They had bled. And the mighty British army had paid in blood for every yard of ground. Stories spread quickly of Colonel Prescott pacing the lines, calmly steady under fire, of black militiaman Peter Salem felling a British officer with a perfect shot, of broken muskets used like clubs, of retreating men turning to fight again, and of Dr. Warren's death, a martyrdom that lit a fire in men's hearts. They began to believe something dangerous and powerful, that they could win. A few days later, General George Washington arrived in Massachusetts. Tall, stern, quiet. He wore a blue coat with buff trim and a sash across his chest, the new commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But the army he inherited was little more than a militia in name, a loose patchwork of New England volunteers and provincial regiments, ill-supplied, poorly trained, no uniforms, little discipline. Some men had no bayonets, others had no shoes. Still, they had something Washington couldn't ignore, a newfound belief. Bunker Hill had seen to that. He toured the lines, inspecting redoubts, speaking to officers, taking stock of men and material. He found soldiers sleeping in barns, rifles resting on hay bales, men who drilled by day and returned to their farms at dusk. It wasn't an army, not yet, but it would be. In London, the news landed like a thunderclap. A victory, yes, but a bitter, costly one. Parliament was stunned at the casualty figures. Over 1,000 British dead and wounded, from colonial militia. Whispers began. That perhaps this wasn't a mere rebellion. Perhaps it was something worse. Something that couldn't be put down by force alone. King George III had no such doubts. To him the colonies had drawn blood, and blood must answer for blood. He doubled down, declared the colonies in open rebellion, authorised the recruitment of Hessian mercenaries from Germany, ordered the mobilisation of tens of thousands of additional troops. There would be no compromise now. The war had begun in earnest. Meanwhile, back in Boston, the British dug in. Though they controlled the city and the Charlestown Peninsula, they were effectively trapped. The Americans held the high ground all around, tightening the noose. Supplies grew scarce. Food had to be shipped in from the sea. Fresh water was limited. Tensions rose between officers and locals. Boston, once a proud jewel of the British Empire, was becoming a prison. And outside its walls, George Washington was building a new kind of force. One united not by colony, but by cause. As the summer wore on, Washington set about transforming his ragtag militias into an army worthy of the name. He implemented discipline, established ranks, called for engineers, artillerymen, surgeons. He brought in men like Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller with a passion for cannon and a brilliant mind for logistics. They began fortifying positions around Boston, building redoubts, trenches, and batteries. The work was exhausting, but the men began to take pride in it. Washington knew they could not dislodge the British yet, not without heavy guns, but winter would bring opportunity. And in the meantime, he worked to unify the troops, to turn Virginians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders into something new. Americans. In the British ranks, morale faltered. The memory of Bunker Hill haunted them. Some regiments had lost their entire officer corps. Veterans whispered that the rebels weren't just angry peasants. They were deadly, determined, dangerous. New recruits arrived, but they were wary, unfamiliar with the terrain, uneasy around the smouldering ruins of Charlestown. Desertion crept into the ranks. Discipline began to fray, and still the Americans tightened the noose. For the ordinary civilians of Boston, life became a slow descent into misery. Patriot sympathizers had either fled or were lying low. Loyalist families lived in fear, knowing retribution could come from either side. Bread was rationed, salted meat was prized, fresh produce was a rumour. Gunpowder blackened the air. Children played among burnt timbers. Women wept for husbands buried in mass graves. And all the while, the red flag of the British Empire fluttered over a city choking on its own occupation. Outside the city, American forces gained strength. By October, the Continental Army numbered more than 20,000 men. Crude barracks were built. Drill routines were established. Couriers raced from post to post. But still, they lacked something critical. Artillery. That would change, in a most improbable way. Far to the west, in the icy wilderness of upstate New York, a miracle was brewing. Fort Ticonderoga, a former French stronghold now in American hands, held dozens of heavy cannon captured earlier in the year. But they were stranded, isolated, useless where they stood. Enter Henry Knox. He proposed a feat so audacious that many thought him mad. He would travel to Ticonderoga in midwinter, retrieve the cannon and haul them, all 60 tons of iron and brass, back across mountains, rivers, and snow-choked forests to Boston, over 300 miles, with no proper roads, no proper sleds, just oxen, manpower, and grit. Washington approved the plan, and with that, the seeds of Boston's liberation were sown. By December, snow blanketed the countryside. Knox set out with a small team. carpenters, woodsmen, labourers. They dragged the guns down from the fort, lashed them to sledges, and began the long, treacherous haul east. Frozen rivers cracked under the weight. Horses slipped. Men fell. More than once an entire cannon threatened to sink into the ice. But they persevered. Through blizzards, through exhaustion, through sheer, bloody-minded determination. It took 2 months. When the first of the cannon finally arrived at Cambridge, in January of 1776, Washington's eyes gleamed. These were the tools he needed, the guns that would change the war. On March 2nd, 1776, the Continental Army opened fire. Not at Boston, but at its flanks. Diversionary bombardments struck British positions, drawing their attention. Then, under the cover of darkness on the night of March 4th, Washington made his move. He ordered the newly arrived cannon hauled to the summit of Dorchester Heights, a strategic bluff overlooking Boston and its harbour. All night, teams of soldiers and labourers worked in silence, digging emplacements, positioning cannon, stacking earthworks. By dawn, the British awoke to a terrifying sight. Guns, dozens of them, aimed directly at the city and the fleet. General Howe recognised the peril instantly. Dorchester Heights was the key. If left unchecked, American artillery would devastate British positions, sink ships, and trap the army entirely. He prepared for an assault to retake the high ground, just as he had done at Bunker Hill. But a vicious snowstorm swept in, grounding the attack. By the time the skies cleared, the American defences were too strong. Howe had no choice. He ordered a withdrawal. On March 17th, 1776, 10 months after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British evacuated Boston. More than 11,000 soldiers and loyalists boarded ships and sailed away. No shots were fired, no lives were lost, but it was a moment of profound triumph. The cradle of rebellion had expelled the empire, and a city once occupied stood free again. Bunker Hill had faded from the smoke and gunfire of June, but its shadow loomed large. In the minds of British officers, it lingered like a wound that wouldn't close, a constant reminder that the enemy was no longer a mob to be scattered, but a force to be reckoned with. In the hearts of American patriots, it became a legend, not a defeat, but a proof of principle, that redcoats could be stopped, that liberty was worth the blood. That revolution might just be possible. As the war expanded beyond Boston, the name Bunker Hill echoed in barracks, churches, and town squares across the 13 colonies. Recruiters invoked it, artists painted it, newspapers printed sensationalized accounts, some true, others wildly embellished. It didn't matter. The story had taken on a life of its own, and stories, when they catch fire, can light the path of nations. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was still debating the shape of rebellion. Was this a call for reform, or the beginning of full-blown independence? Many delegates remained cautious. They wanted reconciliation, respect, a voice in Parliament. But with each passing month, the middle ground shrank beneath their feet. News of British escalation hardened hearts. The hiring of Hessian mercenaries in particular, German soldiers fighting for a king thousands of miles away, enraged the colonists. It confirmed what many had feared. This was no misunderstanding. It was war. By early 1776, the question shifted from if there would be a break to when. Into this uncertain moment came a short, powerful pamphlet, printed in plain type, easy to read and impossible to ignore. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. In it, Paine argued not for negotiation, but for independence, for self-determination, for a clean break from monarchy itself. He drew on Bunker Hill, on the courage shown by ordinary men, on the blood spilled under the guns of empire, and made his case in simple, searing language. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. The pamphlet spread like wildfire, in taverns, in parlours, on the front lines, and slowly the centre gave way. Patience snapped, caution turned to resolve. On July 4th, 1776, just over a year after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. It was a leap into the dark. No guarantees, no armies to match Britain's, no navies to protect the coasts. Only a dream, and the memory of a hill where men had stood and fought like equals. As the war dragged on, the British military made many adjustments. After Boston, they shifted tactics, relying more on naval superiority, more mobile campaigns, and Southern loyalist support. But Bunker Hill had taught them something bitter. Underestimating the Americans would cost them dearly. They would never again approach battle with the same swagger they brought to Charlestown. General Howe himself, once the golden boy of the British High Command, found his reputation tarnished. His future campaigns were more cautious and more conflicted. By 1778, he had resigned his command altogether. On the American side, the lessons of Bunker Hill went deeper. It had revealed the raw courage of the men, but also their desperate need for training, supply, and unity. Washington took it to heart. Throughout the war, he worked tirelessly to professionalize the army, to build something greater than scattered militias. He knew that if they wanted to win independence, bravery alone would not suffice. They needed discipline, structure, command. In a very real way, Bunker Hill became a blueprint, a warning and a promise. For the men who survived that day, the memories never faded. Decades later, veterans would describe the powder smoke, hanging so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The strange silence before the first volley. The shock of watching trained British lines stumble and fall under their fire. One farmer, turned soldier, John Lowell, wrote in his old age, "I still hear the drums, not in dreams, but when I am awake." As if they never stopped. Another, a black militiaman named Barzillai Lou, who fought on Breed's Hill with distinction, later composed songs of the battle, passing its memory down through music and verse. These were not professional soldiers, they were artisans, labourers, slaves, sons. But on that day they became something more. They became a warning to tyranny. In Boston, the scars of battle lingered. The charred ruins of Charlestown were slowly rebuilt. Mass graves were tended to with reverence. Monuments began to appear. Modest at first, then more grand. The Bunker Hill Monument, a soaring obelisk of granite, would not be completed until 1843. But its purpose was clear: to remember that day when liberty first took root in fire and ash. Even the name of the battle, Bunker Hill, became a kind of poetic misstatement. The fiercest fighting had taken place on Breed's Hill, but no one changed it. Because it wasn't about precision, it was about meaning, and Bunker Hill had become sacred. Through the generations, the legend endured. School children memorized the names of the fallen. Artists captured the charge in oil and canvas, some dramatic, others quietly haunting. And the phrase, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," entered American folklore. Not because of its tactical value, but because it symbolized restraint, clarity, defiance under pressure. It became a creed, a whisper of rebellion. Even beyond America, the battle stirred ripples. European observers took note. If colonials could challenge British regulars and survive, perhaps monarchy itself was not so unshakable. Revolutionary spirits in France and beyond looked to the American example as proof that kings could bleed. And for indigenous tribes and enslaved peoples, the irony rang bitter, a war for liberty waged on stolen land, while many still lived in chains. History, as ever, is complicated, but the Battle of Bunker Hill cannot be ignored, because it was the moment the revolution bared its teeth. The field where they fought is now quiet. Visitors walk the hill with camera phones and sun hats, tracing the ghost lines of earthworks long gone. Cannons sit idle on stone pedestals. Grass grows where blood once pooled. But if you listen, really listen, you might still hear the echo of musket fire, the thud of boots on dry soil, the final cry of a man who believed in something larger than himself. The smoke may have cleared, but the fire never went out. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.